The events take place in New York, in the 1930s. Women from high society gossip about Mrs. Erlin, who is notorious for several scandalous affairs with married men. Aristocratic women fear for their husbands when this spectacular person appears nearby. Despite her not-so-young age, Mrs. Erlin can get any man she wants. In public, Stella Erlin carries herself with a proud demeanor, but in reality it's all a facade. She is forced to pawn her jewelry, gifts from numerous admirers, because she no longer has any source of income. Purchasing a first-class ticket on a ship to Italy, Stella hopes to meet a wealthy man who will provide her with a beautiful life. To be more precise, it was about a particular man. Meanwhile in Amalfi, Italy, a young beautiful woman, Meg Windermere, on the advice of Contessa Lucchino, goes to the best glove shop in town. Seeing Meg, Lord Darlington openly began to flirt with her, but he was interrupted by Countess Lucchino, who brought Meg's husband, Robert Windermere. The couple was just looking for a villa to rent here, but due to the influx of tourists, it wasn't easy. Lord John Darlington said he knew of one available. The Windermeres were thrilled with the villa. Meg felt like a fairy tale princess. Once a poor girl, she had received everything she could dream of, thanks to a fortunate marriage. In the evening, the couple attended a society party on John Darlington's yacht. Men from high society drank, played cards and talked about women. Darlington still hadn't married because he hadn't found a worthy match yet. Seeing Meg looking bored, Darlington approached her and offered her a drink, but she refused. Her upbringing didn't allow her to drink alcohol. Meg's mother had passed away long ago. All Meg had left in memory of her was an old portrait in a locket. After the mother's demise, Meg's father never remarried. Darlington's compliments embarrassed the lady, who made it clear that there could be nothing between them except friendship. Upon arriving in Italy, Mrs. Erlin quickly found the young, wealthy beau Robert in a shop. He was buying jewelry for his beloved wife. Mrs. Erlin, charmingly smiling, struck up a conversation with Robert and immediately captivated him. She was a true femme fatale, capable of capturing the attention of any man. Robert bought an expensive gift for Stella, whom he barely knows. Meanwhile, Countess Lucchino spent time with her daughter Alessandra, Tuppy and Darlington over small talk. They noticed Robert in the company of another woman, getting into a car. Robert doesn't know what to do. His wife shouldn't know that he met with Stella Erlin. The next day, Meg was choosing a hat in the boutique while Mrs. Erlin was selecting a dress. Seeing Robert's wife, Stella struck up a conversation with her. They're both American. Stella asked Meg for her opinion on the dress. Meg, being quite conservative, honestly replied that it was rather vulgar. However, this did not embarrass Stella in the least. She always wants to be the center of attention. Among the aristocrats, rumors began to circulate that Robert Windermere was having an affair with Mrs. Erlin, who loves to shine in public and wears only the latest fashionable outfits. Someone clearly gives her generous gifts. In addition to Robert, Stella flirts with Tuppy Augustus, and he succumbs to her charms. Meg still doesn't suspect that the husband is being unfaithful to her. Darlington in turn is in love with Meg, whose thoughts are currently occupied with preparing for her birthday party. When John suggested lunch, Meg agreed, but only if her husband would come too. Upon receiving a call from Stella, Robert said he could meet her in an hour. Of course, lunch with the wife wasn't part of Robert's plans. He doesn't mind if John accompanies her. At that moment, John noticed on Robert's table checks made out to Stella Erlin. Countess Lucchino loves gossip, and in public she refers to Mrs. Erlin as a fallen woman. However, the men condescendingly regard her words. At the market, John bought fresh roasted fish for Meg and entertained her with his jokes. He didn't want to go to a restaurant to prevent Meg from being afraid of the inevitable gossip. Meanwhile, Alessandra, as curious as her mother, continued to watch Robert through binoculars. He met with Stella, who shamelessly spends his money. Robert is tired of lying to his wife, but on the other hand doesn't want to hurt her. When Erlin mentioned that she recently bumped into Meg in the boutique and even chatted with her for a few minutes, it made Robert nervous. He left. Meg was strolling along the coast with John. Meg was sure her husband was saintly and faithful, but John knew for sure that wasn't the case. He didn't tell Meg the truth to avoid upsetting her. Gossip about Mrs. Erlin and Robert is gaining momentum in high society. They are seen together more and more often. Arriving at the villa and not finding her husband, Meg became worried. When he arrived, he asked his wife how lunch went. Meg felt that the husband was hiding something from her. In the evening, the aristocrats visited the theater. Stella flirted with Lord Augustus, which became the subject of further gossip. Robert pretended not to know this woman. Meg remembered seeing Mrs. Erlin in the boutique recently. She also considered her to be an immoral woman. Robert didn't like listening to these rumors. He called all these rumors slander and told the others that they should be ashamed. Meanwhile, Stella continued to flirt with Tuppy, who considered her the most charming and witty woman in town. She really knew how to attract men. To the amazement of the aristocrats who had been watching them all this time, Stella shamelessly led Tuppy out of the theater. They decided to take a walk to enjoy each other's company longer. Tuppy hoped that Stella would invite him in for a drink. She tried to politely refuse him, but Tuppy was persistent. Before bed, Meg told the husband that she wouldn't want Tuppy to come to her party with Mrs. Erlin. Perhaps this would make other guests feel uncomfortable. Robert clearly didn't want to talk about it. Meg wondered why he was defending Stella, who had a reputation as a loose woman. To avoid further conversation, Robert gave his wife a birthday present, a beautiful fan. Meg was very pleased and immediately forgot about everything else. Meanwhile, Stella and Tuppy were also having a great time. He constantly complimented her and even proposed marriage. Stella replied that men don't marry women like her. She had already experienced an unsuccessful marriage. Stella no longer wants to feel trapped. Tuppy, being a very wealthy man, hopes she'll change her mind. Erlin refused him a kiss, saying she doesn't like the smell of tobacco. This didn't upset Lord Augustus because he was completely captivated by this woman. He was even willing to stop smoking for her. When Tuppy left, Erlin lit up a cigarette. The next day, Meg, who turned 21 today, made sure her party was organized to perfection. John presented her with a gift, a very expensive gold bracelet with gemstones. This really embarrassed Meg. John assured her it was a token of friendship. He also hinted that sometimes people want to appear to be someone they're not, so it's important to have a good friend by your side in difficult times. Meg didn't understand why he said that. To settle the bill with the florist, Meg entered her husband's private room for the checkbook. It was then that she saw checks made out to Mrs. Erlin, and the amounts were significant. Meg burst into tears, unwilling to believe that the beloved had betrayed her. Upon learning what had happened, Countess Lucchino immediately visited Meg to support her. In the Countess's opinion, Mrs. Erlin was the kind of woman that men couldn't resist. To avoid leaving Meg alone to mope, Countess Lucchino took her for a walk into town. Meanwhile, Robert was playing golf with Tuppy and asked him not to bring Mrs. Erlin to tonight's party. Tuppy was surprised by this request. He doesn't hide that he's in love with Stella. When Lord Augustus, who was supposed to meet Erlin here, dozed off, Robert had a chance to talk to her alone. Robert wants her to leave town immediately because there are already rumors about them. Stella made it clear that she has no intention of leaving. By the way, she is actually Meg's mother, and Robert knows the truth. At that moment, Dummy, another wealthy friend of Robert's, woke up and overheard the conversation. Meg considers Eileen deceased, but as soon as Meg married a wealthy man, she reappeared. There are no romantic relationships between her and Robert. Meg doesn't understand how the husband could betray her like this. When Robert left, Dummy asked Stella if Meg was really her daughter. Stella reacted as if it were absolute nonsense. Meg did a lot of shopping and didn't get back until the evening. At the party, all the guests were having a great time while Meg cried in her room. No amount of shopping can compensate for the betrayal of a loved one. John was surprised that the birthday girl was nowhere to be found. Robert replied that she was getting dressed and would be down soon. Meg put on the best dress she bought while the guests drank and danced. Today Meg wants to look irresistible. Seeing the lady of the occasion in a shiny provocative dress, everyone was amazed. Robert wanted to go get a shawl for his wife, but she whispered to him that she had seen the checks. Men and women engaged in usual idle chatter. Suddenly Countess Lucchino noticed Mrs. Erlin among the guests, who had obviously come without an invitation. John approached Stella Erlin, mistaking her for Meg. John asked her to leave Tuppy alone and choose Robert so that Meg could finally be free. To Lord Darlington's surprise, Stella said there was nothing between her and Robert. John had been just misinformed. Tuppy is madly in love with Stella. Of course he's not foolish and understands that she's primarily interested in his money. Tuppy in turn values Stella's beauty, so they're even. He bought her the best engagement ring. Meg drank champagne and enjoyed herself, trying not to think about the husband's infidelity, who asked her to stop drinking. Stella's appearance at the party was a surprise to both of them. Now John is sure that Meg will be with him and kissed her, but she ran away. Despite the hurt from her husband's betrayal, Meg cannot stoop as low. John confessed his love to her. She's the first person he truly loved. Now Meg has to make a choice, stay with her unfaithful husband or be happy with someone who respects her. Robert was looking for his wife everywhere. Seeing John, Robert asked if he had seen Meg. She hid, not wanting to talk to the husband right now. John advised Robert to look for her at the bar. Tuppy seems determined to marry Stella. If all goes well, this will be his third marriage. All his friends warned Tuppy about Stella's mercenary nature, but he doesn't care. In the end she allowed him to put the ring on her finger. Many noticed that Mrs. Erlin and Mrs. Windermere look like mother and daughter, even their dresses are the same. While John begged Meg to sail with him to America tomorrow, Robert took Stella aside. He's willing to pay her even more just to make her disappear tomorrow. The engagement with Tuppy changes nothing. Seeing Robert handing a check to Stella, Meg was finally convinced that they were lovers. Meg cried and continued drinking, not understanding what her husband lacked in their marriage. Stella wanted to say goodbye to the daughter she abandoned 20 years ago, but Meg wasn't in the room. Stella found a note from Meg addressed to the husband, stating her intention to leave. Meg no longer wanted to be married to a traitor and went to John's yacht. Hearing footsteps, Stella locked the door. Of course Robert thought his wife was in the room and said that there was never anything between him and Mrs. Erlin. She just knows some secret and blackmails him. Robert loves only his wife and never thought of other women. He was forced to pay Mrs. Erlin, this cold selfish woman, because he didn't want the most precious person to him to feel pain. Of course Stella couldn't open the door. Robert decided that his wife had drunk too much champagne, so it would be better to talk in the morning. The guests were dispersing. Stella turned to Tuppy with an unusual request, to make sure Robert doesn't come home for a few hours. Stella doesn't want any extra questions, she just wants Tuppy to do it. He was willing to do anything for her, so he promised to distract Robert. Meanwhile, Meg was waiting for John on his yacht and never expected to see Stella here, who assured her that she was supposedly an old family friend, so Robert gave her money. Meg didn't believe a word of this woman, being sure that Robert sent her here. To prove that he doesn't know about their conversation, Stella showed Meg her own note. Now Robert is sure his wife is asleep. If Meg leaves the husband and returns to America with John, she will lose the most important thing in her life, love. Meg has always lived by her marriage, and not every woman is capable of that. Hearing John's voices and his wealthy friends, the women hurried to hide. Tuppy and Robert were here too. The men tried to dissuade Tuppy from the idea of marrying Stella, who was only interested in money. Seeing his wife's fan here, Robert thought there was an affair between her and John and struck him. At that moment Stella appeared to save the situation. Tuppy thought she and John were lovers. Stella said she accidentally took Mrs. Windermere's fan. Taking advantage of everyone being distracted, Meg managed to sneak out. Robert decided to play along with Stella to help Meg. Stella on the other hand was going to return the engagement ring to Tuppy, who being very disappointed left. When Robert returned home in the morning, Meg was already in their room. Robert honestly said he spent the night on John's yacht. The spouses embraced, forgiving each other for everything. Learning that Tuppy broke off the engagement with Stella because of the fan, Meg confessed to her husband that it was she who had left the fan in the yacht. Their conversation was interrupted by the maid, who said Meg's father was calling from America. She immediately went to the phone. The maid also handed the fan to Robert, saying the woman who brought it was waiting downstairs. Going down, Robert made it clear to Stella that she was not welcome in this house. Robert doesn't believe Stella feels anything for her daughter because she has always thought only of herself. When Meg came in and saw the guest, she asked her husband to leave them. Meg feels guilty, not wanting to be the reason for Stella and Tuppy's breakup. However, Stella asked Meg not to spoil her one good deed in life and asked the girl to swear on what really mattered to her. Meg swore on the memory of her mother, whom she considered her guardian angel. Meg always dreamed of being like her. Hearing this, Stella barely held back her emotions. She didn't want to disappoint her daughter and left without telling the truth. Robert was okay with that. He'd rather Meg continue to believe in the fairy tale of a loving and caring mother than lose faith in people. Returning the check to Robert, Stella got into a taxi and left. The plane was already waiting for her. Stella didn't notice Meg's fan on the plane right away. It turns out Meg told Tuppy everything, who is ready to marry Stella again. Meg wanted the fan to remain with Mrs. Erlin as a memento of her. Tuppy and Stella left Italy together. John misses Meg very much, but he chose to act nobly.